Commissioners.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Sedgwick County meeting today regarding our staff meeting. So I'll hand it over to the County Manager, Tom Stoltz.
Good morning, Chairman and Commission. We have two items for today. One is our usual COVID update. Adrian will talk about what the numbers are doing. Tim will talk about the newest information concerning testing and the challenges that we're having within the system. He will also talk about a recommendation or a conversation we had with Dr. Mins yesterday. Rusty will give us an update on the KDEM supplies that he briefed you about a week or two ago with what the status of that project is. And then Tanya will talk about communications and marketing concerning COVID and what some of her staff and outside people have been assisting with on that. And then Dr. Stedman is here to talk about the Regional Forensic Science Center. We had during the budget discussion this year a CIP discussion about a facility upgrade there. It raised a lot of questions with commissioners, and so she's prepared a comprehensive review of the Forensic Science Center and is here today to talk about that as well. So two items that we'll try to get through. So Adrian, if you'll start us up on the COVID update, please.
Morning, Adrian.
Good morning, Commissioners and Board of Health. Adrian Byrne, Sedgwick County Health Director. Start with the numbers. And I gave a presentation last night at Commissioner Dennis's District Advisory Board, and just gave an overview of where we started. And, January 19th was when we first had our first U.S. case. And then in Kansas, it was the 7th of March. And then in Sedgwick County, it was March 19th. And just to give an overview, on March 31st in Kansas, we had 428 cases, and in Sedgwick County, we had 59. On May 20, forward to May 29th, we had in Kansas 9,700 cases, and in Sedgwick County, 575. And then as of July 6th, yesterday, we had 17,000 cases in Kansas and approximately 1,600 cases in Sedgwick County. Just gives a visual of how quickly our cases have increased. And then looking at the metrics that we use, and again, the ones in blue are the top that the state of Kansas is using as well, and that's looking at new deaths, new hospital admissions, and new cases per 100,000 residents. So you can see that the 100,000 residents, new cases, the trend is that it's increasing. And the hospital admissions is a really tricky one to gauge because that number is just indicative of the number of Sedgwick County residents that are admitted to the hospital during that week. It doesn't have the other residents outside of Sedgwick County, since we have regional hospitals that have been admitted, as well as staffing is an ongoing issue with hospitals as it is for all of us dealing with COVID-19. So that's not totally an accurate snapshot when we hear some of the concerns that the hospitals have about their numbers increasing, but those are the numbers that we have for Sedgwick County residents. So if you look at new cases, the trend is continuing, and even though in this last week you will see that our numbers slightly declined in regards to new cases, new non-cluster and community disease cases, it's not a trend. We need more than 1 week for it to be a trend. And so that's why there is an increasing trend still versus stable, because it's just 1 week. If we have another week, then it's looking more like a trend, but as far as stable, but right now we're still looking at it being increasing when you look at the numbers in the previous weeks and can see how high the new cases are. And just a reminder, the new cases in the beginning, everything was lumped into new cases, and it really, we pulled out clusters just to give more of an idea of what was going on in our community versus nursing homes and others. And the new non-cluster cases, that removes all clusters, businesses, long-term care facilities, anything that is in there. And the new community disease cases, that is removing nursing homes, that's removing residential clusters, so that we are showing just what's going on in the community. So the handful of business clusters that we had would have been in that number, if that makes sense. So you can see that new tests are continuing to trend. Since we've stopped testing all asymptomatic, it'll be interesting to see what that number is for this week. We've heard the other clinics are overwhelmed now that we've stopped doing that, and we had been referring to Ascension via Christian Murdoch and to our community clinics, and now we've heard that they're overwhelmed and scheduling out over a week for appointments. So there's still very much a desire for asymptomatic people, those with no symptoms, to be tested because of increasing cases in our community or increasing anxiety around that. Our new test per 100,000 residents is still up, and our percent positive is 6.1, a little bit lower than the week before, but still very much an increase from the previous weeks. And that is my presentation. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Commissioner Cruz.
Thank you, Chairman. Can you talk about the data that you sent us last night as far as the triage line and how many people are actually able to answer these calls? I've had a ton of questions about people not being called back, just the overabundance of calls. Can you share with this, please?
Well, I don't have that document with me, but yes, we've started to compile that report so that we can show just how many calls we have coming into. Not only we have a COVID-19 box that gets general questions to it, and then our triage line is the line that when someone calls 211 that they're transferred to, and we're still getting a tremendous amount of asymptomatic people calling in saying they were exposed to a case. Now, whether they're actually considered a high risk close contact is one thing, but there's a lot of people that believe that they've been around someone and they may not fall into that investigation as a close contact, but we are scheduling them for an appointment as well. So the calls have continued to come in. So we have two different pieces there. One is the disease investigators and EPIs and the amount of calls that they need to return for positives, and we're returning those calls 24, 26 hours after we get the result, which is always our goal, if not in less time. And the negatives were up to at least 3 days. And as Tim will talk a little bit about, found out on a call yesterday that testing is stressed all over the country, where labs are taking 5 to 7 days to get any results, positives and negatives. So we have found that the negatives can take a little bit longer to get back at times because the labs are prioritizing the data getting entered as well, because everybody is really stressed and overwhelmed, stressed as far as the system being strained with all the COVID tests that are coming in. So we're in a good place with calling back positives when we get those results. And again, it varies depending upon what lab that we use and if all of their equipment is functional. And the negatives, we were a good 3-4 days behind. We brought in more people, so we're now within 48 hours of calling back negatives, and the goal there is within 24 hours as well. So we continue to add temporary staff and pull people when we can from other programs. And then the triage line, we're adding more, added 4 staff last week because of the priority to get scheduled is always symptomatic people, and we still have some in the old asymptomatic line that were a week ago Friday, We have another box that is for priority asymptomatic, and priority asymptomatic are going to be those first responders and medical staff, nursing home, correction staff. So those mailboxes are in the process of getting set up so that they can be directed where they need to be versus us going through and flagging all priority asymptomatic.
So I guess I just want, everybody to understand that as of yesterday, 7/6, we had 3 people taking live calls. Is that how I read this? And
Well,
then we had number of people answering voicemails today was 6, with 6 additional doing it from 2 to 4 hours. We received a total of 447 voicemails. I want people to know these numbers. So when they
Yes.
call me and they're very, very upset about not receiving a call back, they know that our system is overloaded. Our system is overloaded. So the current total incompleted voicemails in the mailbox is 1,220. It's a lot of people to return calls. So what, I see over here on the last page, when we talked about hiring new staff, we have started employment as of 7/6, so that's yesterday. We had 15 people start yesterday.
Yes,
Okay, so that's great.
yes.
Then we have 8 with a start date of 7/13. So that's next week. We have 26 people in progress. So we do. They don't have a start date yet, but we do have 26 people in the pipeline.
Yes.
So how many? So we have all of our positions filled, or are we still looking for people to help us?
We're primarily looking for medical staff at this point.
Okay. And what type of medical staff are you talking about?
Nurses, because we would like to have 2 teams for our mobile unit due to the demand, and also have a second team to do the drive-through so that we're able to extend beyond 2.5, 3 hours so that we can eventually hit the pause button so that there's not a pause button on asymptomatic testing. So that has been a struggle because there are organizations and temporary services that don't want the liability of having their medical staff sample people. So that is one of the challenges, but we have been able to find some nurses, particularly when we changed the full-time to part-time, but still do need additional nurses. And the triage line have added more people as of yesterday to return calls. So usually at any one time, we have at least 6 people responding to calls. And at first they were, in the last couple of weeks, we're just responding to returning voicemails. And so now we have some doing live and then responding to voicemails. But if someone has a family of 6 or so that need tested, each call can take half hour, 45 minutes at the minimum. So we're not able to go through those calls as quickly as people might think that we are. And so we're also hiring temporary. So that the goal is always to look at how we can problem solve and provide better customer service.
So these are calls returning testing results, and what about contact tracing?
The triage line, we do get calls on the triage line for people wanting test results, but primarily the triage line is for scheduling people for testing. And we have heard rumors that we're not able to get people in for testing for several days. That is not true. We still have capacity every day to add symptomatic people. So if someone called last night and they were called back today, they should have gotten in either today or definitely tomorrow for testing.
Well, I appreciate this report. This was very informative. I think we all got it last night. I don't know what time, but I poured through it. It was good information. I really can't thank you enough for working the tireless hours that you do. I know that tensions are high. I know I had 2 pretty heated conversations yesterday with people about not receiving phone calls back, and I'm trying to ease tensions and trying to explain really what's going on, because I think at the very beginning it was all about our hospital system, hospital system, hospital system, hospital system. Let me repeat it, hospital system. But it's the whole system that is now being overloaded, and so I appreciate what you're doing. And please
Thank
let
you.
your staff know that.
And we do have a sign that tells people that to expect results in 5 to 7 days. But what's difficult to add to that is that it depends upon also if it's a weekend, if it's a holiday. So there's other factors, and I totally can appreciate people's frustration with not knowing in a timely manner. We can only respond once we get the information into the state EpiTrack system, and sometimes that's timely and sometimes it's not. But I'm definitely looking at what we need to do to take care of any gaps that we have on our side.
Okay. Any other questions? Commissioner Howe?
Just one quick follow-up question to that. I'm curious if the test results come back and they're in different bins, so to speak, the negatives are over here and the positives over there. Does someone who does the negative call back, do they have to have the same qualifications as everyone else? It seems like that ought to be something that people just are anxious to get the information. It's your results are negative. That's a pretty quick call. I was just curious if there's a way to differentiate.
Well, we have separate inboxes for people that need scheduled to be tested, but all the results come back in the EpiTrack system. And the EpiTrack system is actually a case management system, so it's easier to detect, like positives stand out. They're easier, it's easier to recognize positives. It's a little bit more tedious and time consuming to find negatives just because of how the system is. So once the negatives are pulled, then they can be given to someone just to call. But you have to have someone that is able to go in the EpiTrack system, has been approved to go into that system. But yes, it's a matter of once that information is pulled and printed, it can be given and people can call.
I understand the positives takes quite a long time for someone to ask a lot of questions. It's a half an hour long call or whatever it would be, at least 45 minutes or an hour, whatever it would be. But those negative calls happen pretty quickly, I would think. Since 90% of the cases, since about 90% of the test results are in fact negative, it seems like there ought to be a lot more phone calls regarding the negative results. And if there's a way to separate those out, and I think I'm trying to find the email that Commissioner Cruz just referenced, and for some reason I can't find it now, but I did see it yesterday. What I remember though is I think the person that does the negative callbacks is, how many people do we have doing that?
Well, we have added, last week added 3 or 4 staff just to call negatives back. Okay. But the challenge, because I've asked that same question, can't we just query who's negative in the system? And the system is just not a friendly system. But we're getting caught up with those added people, we're getting caught up, and now, as of today, are 48 hours out from calling negatives. So we are getting caught up.
Okay, I'll continue to track that. I appreciate that things are getting better. It has been frustrating. I think for us to do testing, if we don't get data back for 7, 8 days, or even sometimes longer than that, then it's not helping too much. We've got to get the data back quickly, and that's one of my biggest, I believe that's one of our biggest opportunities, is to get that data quickly. That'll help us get a handle on what's going on in the community. Thank you.
Are they doing batch testing where we're sending?
Yes.
Okay. Can you just explain that for those who might not know what that is?
Batch, so if we send, and it really depends upon where we send, because we have Cahill, which is the state lab in Topeka, and that goes by courier. We have Cinechips in Kansas City that goes by courier, and even the one here in Sedgwick County goes by courier. But if we send 40 to Cahill, then they're going to take all of those tests and run them, hopefully at one time. But they're getting tests in from all over the county and all over the state, depending upon where we're sending it. But many are run at one time.
So batch testing is where they run one. If they're all negative, then they're all negative. But if one comes up positive, then they have to rerun them all. right?
That I don't know for sure.
That's correct.
Tim, can you help us with that? Are you gonna talk about that later?
I wasn't, but I sure can. I got
Okay.
all kinds of stuff to talk about.
Oh, awesome.
Put that in there, too.
Looking forward to it.
Okay.
Okay.
Adrian, I have a quick question. Your first line, new deaths, says 24. If I add it all up, it says 24, but our reports every day for the last week have said 28.
I'm having a difficult time hearing you, but
Your report on new deaths, if you add it up, adds up to 24. And 0 last week and 2, so anyway. But anyway, our daily message that we get shows 28 deaths since the start.
and this data isn't historical. It's new deaths as of 4/19 to 4/25, and then goes from there. So the report on the number on our main Sedgwick County web page has the accurate number.
Okay, so there's probably 4 deaths before 4/19. Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Okay, thank you, Adrian. I don't see
You're
any.
welcome, thank you.
Good morning, Commissioners. Tim Kaufman, Deputy County Manager. I'll talk some more about testing, and I will try and answer any questions that you may have as well. Last week, the Health Department tested 1,095 people over a 4-day work week, and part of that 4th day was truncated because of the weather. We had lightning strike possibilities, and so we had to defer some folks to a later date. Of those, 359 happened at 2 different mobile sites, and about 9% of the overall tests were done by what we call the Disease Containment Unit, and that's a group of staff that we haven't really talked about much, but they work with facilities, usually in congregate care areas where they'll go in and they will test folks. Oftentimes, they'll test maybe the residents of a setting and the staff at the same time so that they can get that taken care of. Sometimes it's going to be a nursing home facility, it may be a group home, it may be some kind of a correctional facility. So the disease containment unit is out every week doing testing as well. Of those that we tested, about 40% were symptomatic and about 60% were asymptomatic that met one of those special category criteria. So they were a close contact of a positive case, they're a first responder, they're a healthcare worker, or they work in one of those congregate settings. So while we have curtailed self-identified asymptomatic testing, we continue to test a great number of folks that are asymptomatic because we know that that's an important part of the process as well. But again, we're limiting it to those people that meet one of those special criteria. The rate of the tests that are returning as positive has increased really quite a bit over the last 10 days, 2 weeks. And as that happens, that has challenged the system, and it creates a great deal of additional work each time a result comes back as positive. The active case numbers here in Sedgwick County has increased by 200, a little over 200, or 33% in less than a week. I sent you an email last week that the number was 620, and I think this morning was 840 possibly. That's a really dramatic increase. And so every one of those positive results then creates not only that initial contact to counsel the individual about the results that they've got, but then all of the follow-up work that goes on with them forever until they become, until they recover. And so that's another issue that is stressing the system, as you pointed out, Commissioner. The system is stressed in many different places in many different ways. These positive results are stressing the system that we have in place as well. So we'll continue to ask for additional staff. We'll continue to try and hire staff. I'll be back tomorrow as we talk about CARES funding, about some additional staff so that we can address some of the issues that have already come up in this conversation. We've talked some about the length of time that it takes to return calls, particularly the negative calls. And Commissioner Howell, you're correct. It takes a less skilled individual to be able to make that call about a negative rather than the positive, because there's a tremendous amount of counseling that goes along with that positive result information. And so we're working on kind of splitting that up, but you'll see that in the ask for positions that I have tomorrow, because some positions are easier to fill than others. Adrian talked a little bit about the medical staff. We really struggle to hire nurses, and we need some more nurses working with us, and so we'll continue to try and recruit those, but that's a challenge that we're facing. And to be honest, before this pandemic ever happened, there was a nursing shortage in our community and in many different communities. This has just really highlighted the impact of having a nursing shortage anywhere. Yesterday, on a call with local health departments, KDHE indicated that nationally, lab results are taking somewhere between 5 and 8 days to get back. And Adrian mentioned the health department's goal is to return those calls then to the people who've been tested within 24 to 48 hours. But the focus and the emphasis is always going to be on the individuals that have positive results. And so we're going to prioritize those calls higher. And in fact, over the weekends, and Adrian mentioned this a little bit, we focus all of the limited number of staff that we have working on the weekends to calling positive cases, because we get positive results every day. And so that can add another 48 hours for folks that have a negative result. Do we like that it's taking anywhere between, it can take up to 8 to 10 days for negative results to be notified? Absolutely not. But, and so I'll be here tomorrow to ask for some additional staff that will help us do more of those calls and do those in a more timely basis. Right now, our lab results with the 2 labs that we're using are not taking those 6 to 8 days. We're getting back a little bit faster than that, but that is what many people across the country are facing right now if they're using one of the big national labs. And so hopefully we'll continue to be able to utilize the labs that we have. We are evaluating lab alternatives on a weekly basis. We're looking at other local labs to see if they're able to help us, and we have to evaluate the increase in overhead as we add an additional lab to the process versus the value that we get in getting those results back in the same time or quicker. So we'll continue to do those evaluations routinely. We have enlisted the help of the med school. There's some faculty at the med school that we have asked to help us do some evaluation of testing modalities, of equipment that you use. We know that we need to add some lab capacity in town. We've got a lab, a certified lab at the health department. We need a piece of equipment that would allow us to run these tests ourselves. They're helping us evaluate some of the different options of testing equipment and helping us figure out what the right tool is. We're working with purchasing right now to figure out how can we get that as quickly as possible once we get the equipment identified that's right for our lab. As I mentioned, we're using KU faculty to help us evaluate different types of tests and help us to know when it's time to switch to a different test or add a different type of test into the testing that we do. And we're also working with ITS to help us automate some of these routine processes. It would be ideal if we had a patient portal that would allow individuals to go in and find their negative test results themselves. And so we need to automate, we need some technology tools that will help do some of that communication on the back end. Certainly don't want to let, we can't replace all of the communication with technology. We need staff, skilled staff, to call people with positive results and kind of talk them through what does that mean, how do they need to behave, what kind of behaviors will help diminish the spread. But I think we can automate some of that negative result notification on the back end. It's just going to take time to identify the right tools and get those purchased and installed, but we'll continue to do that. In terms of testing, we plan to test on West Central through 7/14. We're going to move the testing process on the 15th, and we will start sampling then at our Edgemore site on 7/16. That is the plan right now. So there'll be a day that week when we won't be doing any testing at the drive-through sampling site. We'll still have the disease containment unit out and that sort of thing. But that's our plan right now for moving the tests. Commissioner, you had asked about pool testing, and pool testing is where they take a number of samples, it may be 10 or 20, a relatively small number, and they mix that sample together and they test it all at once. And if it's all negative, then they've got the results and they've only run one test. They've tested 10 or 20 samples and they know they're all negative. And so that speeds up the process for the lab a little bit, and it reduces the amount of reagents and things that the lab use on their end. And if they discover that there's a positive, if that batch sample, that pool sample comes back positive, then they'll go back and they will sample each of those tests individually to identify the individual sample that became negative. That is a decision that the labs are making right now on how to manage those processes. I'm not sure I'm confident that Cahill is not doing pool testing. I can't tell you whether or not our other lab is doing pool testing or not. We'll follow up and ask them. But that's really a decision that the lab makes because it helps them do two things. And hopefully those national labs are doing that as well, because it does reduce the amount of time, the amount of tests that you have to run. And so it should shorten the time to get results back out, particularly those negative results. But that's what pool testing is. Mm-hmm. It's relatively new. It seems to be pretty promising for lab efficiency and efficiency in use of the equipment and the reagents and that sort of thing as well. And then one other thing that I was going to talk about was a conversation that we had with Dr. Minns yesterday. Dr. Minns continues to be concerned. We talked last week a couple of times with him. He continues to be concerned about the rate of increase in positive tests that we're seeing in the community. I mentioned that we went from 600 active cases to 800 active cases in a very short period of time. So we've got a lot more active cases right now. And he recommended, conversation Tom and Mike and I had last night, that we, as he recommended the other day, a mask order is one of the few things that we have available to help us that is relatively low impact on businesses and that sort of thing. He also suggested that we adopt or endorse or enforce, I don't know the right word to use, but Phase 3 includes a gathering size limit of 45. So if you look back at the Ad Astra plan, Phase 2 was a 15 limit. We had modified that at one point in time to 20. And right now, it would appear that many organizations are operating without a gathering limit. And so if we could reintroduce a gathering limit at 45, it's his belief that that would help slow the spread, because right now we're in a position where we need to do as many different things as we can to slow the spread. And contact tracing is critically important, testing is critically important, but it's not, since it's the tool that we've used primarily for the last 2 or 3 weeks, we've seen this huge increase in active cases. And so it would appear that we need some additional help to slow things down so that we don't overwhelm our health department and our staff anymore. So that was the conversation that we had with Dr. Minns yesterday. And I would be happy to answer any questions about testing or anything else that I've mentioned.
Okay. Thanks, Tim. Any questions? Okay, I don't see any. Thank you.
Okay.
Good morning, Chairman, Commissioners. Very briefly, just wanted to give you an update. Last week I came in and spoke about an opportunity that the state had offered to provide some protective equipment, non-medical protective equipment to local businesses. We pushed out the information. The order opportunity ended this morning. We had about 257 requests submitted, which amounted to almost right around 3 million pieces of protective equipment that have been requested. The state, we anticipate, will deliver within a matter of days, and we believe by early next week we will be in a position to start delivering the materials that they bring us. We don't know exactly how much we're going to get and whether it's going to fill everybody's order in full, but we will know that by the weekend, I believe, how much material we're going to get. And so early next week, with the help of the staff that we have, including our management interns, and then with some volunteers that are being organized on our behalf, we should be pushing those materials out to our businesses who place those orders by early to mid next week. So otherwise, we are continuing to have our medical entities and our first response entities who report weekly and also place orders through the Emergency Operations Center. And we're still going about around 100 organizations strong who are still providing burn rate and material on hand reports to us, and in some instances still requesting some assistance through our warehouse with protective equipment for their medical related operations, just so you're aware of that as well. So we haven't changed much. That operation, that warehouse operation, is still vitally important, and then next week we will be tied up the biggest part of the week trying to get these 3,000 pieces of material out to our businesses. That's all I have for you this morning. If you have any questions.
Okay, thanks. Dan. Morning, Tanya.
Morning, Chairman and Commissioners. Tanya Cole, Assistant County Manager. As you're aware, our communications team has been working with Bothner and Bradley and CML Collective and A, B, and C bilingual resources who represent the African American community and Hispanic and Latino community to come up with a public awareness campaign and outreach implementation plan. So starting last week and this week, I hope that you've been able to see our communications in several areas in the community with our Healthy Behaviors Public Awareness Campaign initiative. Our goal with this campaign is 8 weeks, and what I'd like to do is just walk you through some of our media platforms that we've been using. Our first one is our outdoor billboards. We purchased 18 static billboards that will run for 18 weeks. And as you can see here, here is some of our billboards that you'll see out in the community. Our next media platform that we used are radio spots. So we've run this on KDGS, which is Radio Lobo, KHLT, which is La Raza, and KDGS, which is Power 93.5. COP Media, who's our media buyer, is also working with community-based programs on KFDI, KFXJ, and KICT to schedule on-air interviews, which will provide us with some more exposure. So let me play this for you real quick. This is the radio ads that you'll hear.
Prevent the spread of COVID-19 in Sedgwick County by wearing a mask if you are able, washing your hands often with soap and water, and practicing social distancing by keeping 6 feet between you and others. Call United Way of the Plains at 211 to schedule a COVID-19 test at no cost through the Health Department. Visit sedgwickcounty.org to find out more.
Okay, we've also had several newspaper ads placed, and we will be placing those in Active Age, Derby Informer, Wichita Eagle, Sedgwick County Post, Mount Hope Clarion, Community Voice, Times Sentinel, West Side Story, East Wichita News, Ark Valley News, Bel Air Breeze, Park City Post, and Keachai Lamp. We are also doing social media ads, and that'll be in Facebook, Instagram, and we're also doing geofencing, which is, I've never heard of that before, but it's if you go into a certain area in town, they kind of hit you no matter what you're on, if you're on a laptop, if you're on your phone, any type of media, technology type, they'll hit you with an advertising campaign. And I've talked to COP Media, and they have informed me so far they've had 2,000 hits on our website based on this advertising, and so that's just 2 weeks so far that we've had 2,000 hits to our website. And so I think it's important that we continue to continue our public awareness campaign of these safe practices as we move through the pandemic. And so tomorrow I'll be coming to you with an additional request for funding. And I think another thing that we want to do is hit some media platforms that we've not hit. And so I'll be looking to do some TV spots, as well as doing some digital billboards in the future. So, and then we also have some really creative ideas that are also swirling, and ways that we can hit and engage the community, as well as some community members also with the public campaign as well. I realize that I didn't hit this as well, so let me show you this. This is a social media campaign, and this is in Hispanic language, so let me play this for you as well. So that would be something that you would see on social media. And again, these are our digital display ads. So I would be happy to stand for any questions that you might have on our public awareness campaign. But like I said, I will be back tomorrow to ask for additional fundings, just so we can move that to some other media platforms as we move forward.
Yes, thanks, Tanya. Did you say that's in there somewhere?
I did not. Kate Flavin has been reaching out to the chamber and been in constant contact with them and working with them. As you're aware, we do have flyers and information that is in the Vietnamese language, and we'll continue to work with them as well.
Commissioner Cruz?
Thank you, Chairman. Are we going to have any sort of communication around people where people can pick up masks? So since there is, we are ordering a lot. I received an email yesterday. If someone needed a mask, where would they go to get one of those?
Well, as we receive them, I think we need to figure out how we're going to market that. And there's something happening every day. For example, Wichita substation, police substations now have 10,000 masks that they can hand out. So literally, we'll have to watch and help market that. And as we receive, and the email commissioners were referencing is, we've placed 2 orders for 500,000 on each order of masks. So we'll essentially be ordering 1 million masks, and how we distribute and get those moved out, we'll have to, as we get those, we'll have to strategize on that.
Okay. Great job.
Yeah, I want to give kudos to our communications team, and Tony Giuliano especially, because he did a lot of great work on that. So thank you for that, Commissioner.
Commissioner O'Donnell?
Thank you. Tanya, I love the PSAs. I think those are wonderful, very well produced. Those are the types of things that I'm hearing from the public they want more of, you know, for the county, and it goes along with how we voted last week that we want to strongly recommend this, and these are the factors that go into maintaining a healthy community, which is the goal of all 5 of us. So this plays very well into our plan and strategy. So thank you for that. I'm very excited for that. And do you know, like, what the flight dates of these PSAs are going to be?
Are you talking about the ones that we are doing right now?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So they started last week, and so they'll run for 8 weeks. So I think it's just at the very start of August. And so when we're talking about this new campaign that I want to, when I come to
end of August?
Yeah, start of August. So I think, well, maybe I need to look, but I think it's sometime in August. But it's 8 weeks. So this new, when I come to you for additional funding, we want to get started on that right away with the TV spots and the digital billboards. And so I'm looking at running that for probably 16 weeks, so we can get started on that right away too. So
wonderful. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Okay, I don't see any other questions, but Commissioner Howell.
Actually, I apologize. I have maybe some questions for Adrian after we're done with Tanya. Thank you.
Okay,
I'm sorry.
sure.
Tom, is there anything else? We'll have Adrian come up.
Yeah, if there's other questions, sure.
Adrian Burns, Sedgwick County Health Director.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. I have just a couple quick questions. I was just still thinking about some of the stuff you presented this morning, and I'm looking at it, and can you please explain to me a little bit further, or just remind me once again, when it says under investigation, what are we doing with that? Is that someone who's waiting for test results, or is it someone who's tested positive and there's
So what was the first
tracing
part of the
going on?
question? What do we do when someone's investigated?
Well, if something says under investigation, what do we mean by that specifically?
It means that the 840 that Tim had mentioned as far as active cases,
PUI, what does PUI mean? Is that what you're asking?
a person under investigation for hospital, during the hospital data, that they have tested them and the results are pending.
Does that mean they're experiencing symptoms and then we suspect that they're positive and they're being treated like they're positive?
Well, I think when you're talking about PUI, that's related to the hospitals, not so much what we are working with, because we are either dealing with close contacts or cases.
But Commissioner, to answer your question, that is exactly what it means in the hospital world. They have a patient there who is displaying symptoms of COVID. They have administered a test and they're awaiting results.
Another interesting thing is the last email I got from you, Tom, that talks about some of the hospitalization numbers. It mentions that one of our hospitals has some outpatient treatment happening. I don't know what that is exactly. How do they do outpatient treatment at the hospital?
That is, the VA has a lot of outpatient treatment happening at this time, and that is patients who have come in displaying symptoms of COVID. They have tested positive, and they have sent them back home with instructions on how to take care of themselves. So they're treating them, but they are not physically in the hospital.
I guess I'm just not sure what the treatment actually entails. It sounds like they're just in isolation waiting for them to get over the illness.
That's part of it.
That's not treatment, but
We'd
that's,
have to ask the physicians how they're treating those people.
I mean, really the active cases, I think unless they're in the hospital, that's what they're all doing.
Right.
Okay.
Well, some are treating, some of the 800 that we have haven't been to the hospital. These are people that actually showed up at the VA, have symptoms, have been diagnosed, sent back home, and continue to stay in contact with VA on their
Okay.
treatment.
One of the things that's in your email as well is there's some concern about high number of staff that are in quarantine, I guess, that we're seeing some challenges at the hospitals with staff that used to quarantine. I'm curious, I don't know if they would have the same rules that we would have in the general public. In other words, if I had a close contact with someone, we need to take precautions and at least quarantine, if not be tested. So in the hospital, since they're treating patients that are COVID positive, and they know that, I assume they have all the PPE that is needed to do that type of work. That's not considered a close contact in that case.
If someone, probably a month or so after COVID came to the United States, and definitely Kansas, the recommendation for who had to quarantine was shifted, that if it was a first responder or someone in the medical community, even residential facilities, and if they had PPE on, like an N95 mask, when they were dealing with someone that ended up being a positive case, that as long as they were asymptomatic, had no symptoms whatsoever, they could continue to work as long as they had their personal protective equipment on. If they developed any symptoms, then they had to stop and go into isolation. But because of the sometimes scarcity of those employees and staff that are working with in residential facilities especially, or hospitals, then yes, that did shift to where they could return to work if they were close contact because of having that PPE on.
Okay. Just another point, and I think it's another little frustration of mine, but on the report that we get sent, you got handed out this morning, I got a copy, so that's an interesting point. I understand our discharges on the dashboard are not necessarily accurate. You've said that, we've said that before. Do we have any way that, I think people have talked about, we're getting information about hospitalizations, but I still don't feel like I'm getting clarity. I have to kind of figure out what's going on. Is there any place I can go to get information regarding what, and I appreciate your email, Tom, but is there any place I can go to get information regularly and accurately and consistently that shows what the hospitalization is currently. Because again, I understand how many people are being admitted, but I have no idea how many people are being discharged. And so I add this up, it doesn't tell me a whole lot. You can just see a trend of admissions. But actually, earlier back in week 1 and week 2, our numbers were just as high as they are right now, the last 3 weeks. We had 17 and 11 back in week 1 and 2. In the last 3 weeks, we had 12, 9, and 11. In fact, before that, let's go back. We had 3, 9, 4, 12, 9, and 11. Those are all numbers that are less than 17 and 11. So I'm just curious what my takeaway is on this. How am I supposed to use this data and understand what's happening inside the hospitals when I don't have the data I really need?
So the email I sent you all yesterday, Commissioners, we are crafting that into a dashboard page, real time, and should hopefully have it out by end of day. And we're going to displace the current hospital data with the data that we're getting from the hospitals every Monday. And you'll begin to see a graph. And I'm after best data here. And the best data to me is when I have hospital CEOs on a telephone call telling me at 11 a.m. on Monday, this is their number, and that number needs to go to you. So you will begin to see trend analysis, and we have last week and this week. We're going to graph it up, put it on a page, and that will become the data I think that I would call best data for you to try to analyze what's going on in the hospitals. So that will be up by end of day, and as we go through time and we continue to move through this pandemic, would be the data I'd recommend that you would rely on.
Another question I have, I think this is probably for Adrian, but if you think of the COVID-19 as a pipeline, the number of people who contract the virus and test positive, they go in, if you will, to a 10 to 14 day pipeline, and eventually there's 2 ways to get out of that category. Either you're going to recover or you're going to die, and that's the only way to come off that list. And so we've had 28 people in Sedgwick County, unfortunately, pass away. But everybody else, I think we, at some point, will consider as recovered unless they succumb to the virus. What I'm curious about is I'm going back 14 days and looking at the numbers of active cases 14 days ago. And as those numbers are continuing to come in, you can go back a week before that, for example, and say, during the week, 3 weeks ago to 2 weeks ago, that week we had a number of active cases. That number is substantially larger than our recoveries for this last week. So I don't understand, if you think of this as a pipeline, how can that be? Again, just to be clear, we only had, according to our dashboard, 9 recoveries in the last 5 days. So I'm just having a little bit of trouble understanding how that could be so low. Go ahead.
Well, people recover at different rates, and originally the isolation was 7 days, and it's always been, or 3 days was fever symptom-free, but that was changed to 10 days because they were finding that people are ill well beyond 7 and 10 days. People can be ill 14, 21 days or longer. So it just depends upon the individual person whether they are symptom-free at 10 days or 30 days. So there's not a clean-cut recovery date. It just depends upon the person, and we have found that it is longer than 10 days.
And just to make sure I understand, we talk about 72 hours after symptoms subside, or 10 days since symptoms onset. Those are the 2 numbers we're using. 72 hours or 10 days.
Well, they have to be at least 10 days or 72 hours after they're symptom free with no medication. So, but it's at least 10 days, but it can be longer and has been longer.
And then looking back, for example, we had a cluster at Lansing Correctional Facility of over 50 cases. And I still see that's on our dashboard. And I'm wondering, that was over 6 weeks ago. Let's say it's close to 7 weeks ago when this showed up on the dashboard, but yet they're still showing there. I'm just wondering, does that make sense that we have roughly 50 cases at Lansing? They're still showing as active cases after 7 weeks.
In order for a cluster to be considered closed, because some of the long-term care facilities continued to be open as well, in order for a cluster to be closed, it has to be 2 incubation periods, which is 28 days after the last case recovers. So that's how some of those stay open for a while.
So even though it shows 50 cases, what that means to me is maybe those 50 cases, they're not active cases necessarily, but out of the 50, someone's still active.
Yes.
That's information I needed to know. Thank you very much. And then just going back to a previous comment, I know Tanya left the room, but I'll just share with Mr. Manager. I have concerns that we're not communicating with our disabled community, and if there's any way to add information on our efforts to include people with inability to receive that through our audio messages, I think we need to do what we can. Again, I understand that newspapers are excellent for people who have hearing issues, but our other media things, if it's both audio and visual, we ought to be adding sign language options to those if possible. And just a comment there, but thank you for the answers.
And just one quick thing on hospitalization, recognizing that both of our public hospitals here, well, actually all three, VA, Wesley, and Via Christi, service patrons outside of Sedgwick County too. So sometimes that's part of the data problem with hospitals is we're getting out of county patients coming into our regional hospital network, which could, alter the numbers slightly from what you're seeing.
I guess back to my, you don't have to answer the question officially here, but one of my questions is if Via Christi and Wesley are talking about patients, and of course the VA did as well. The VA separated out outpatient treatment, and the other two hospitals didn't separate out that term. So I'm not sure if those are all admissions and inpatient treatments, because they don't. My assumption is it's all inpatient, but I don't know that for a fact because now the VA broke out, if you will, an outpatient treatment category. So I don't know if maybe Wesley and Via Christi is saying that the numbers that you gave us are completely inpatient or not.
Yeah, well, what we're focusing on there, if you look at what's going on in the state of Texas today, their system is inundated, their hospital system. That's what we're trying to avoid here. So we're focusing this page and this data for you all on hospital capacity and what they're seeing admitted. Outpatient treatments are people that aren't stressing necessarily. They'll go into the ER potentially, but they're not taking up a bed or a ICU room or a vent in a hospital. So we're trying to focus that on what our hospital's capacity is.
So with all due respect, I appreciate your comment just now. What I don't understand from that, again, my assumption is they're all inpatient. What I don't understand is their capacity. In other words, if I knew their total capacity or their remaining capacity, that would be helpful. Yeah. But I don't have that data. So again, I think we continue to ask for the same thing over and over, and they were still.
I will tell you, and we had the conversation again yesterday yesterday on Monday. When you talk in terms of capacity, they will tell you now it's not a question of beds or vents, it's a question of staff. And even we're recognizing that in our health department at our drive-through. It's not a question of physical capacity, it's a question of the people that are going to run it. And that's why it's very hard, almost impossible for the hospitals. They can give us bed numbers, they can give us room numbers, but they can't give us capacity because it depends on their nursing staff and their physician staff and all of the associated staff that go with running a patient in an ICU environment. So that's the problem with that. What they've given us yesterday, what I sent you, was a number of beds in ICU that are open, but they can't even promise those beds because it depends on the health of their staff. So that's the challenge with that particular dynamic.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman.
Okay, Commissioner Cruz?
Thank you. I just want to reiterate that it's not whether you're positive and in the hospital or recovered, you're going to be fine. I mean, we still don't know enough about this virus. People who recover, right, who are in recovery, still have a lot of health impacts like respiratory problems, digestive system, heart, kidney, liver, brain, nerves, skin, blood vessels, blood clots. I mean, there's a lot of things that we don't know about this, so we can't just assume that just because people are recovered in the typical sense of the word means that they're never going to need to go back into the hospital system for other problems or have lifelong complications because they have contracted this virus. So I think it's important for us to really understand that it's not just about hospital capacity. It's about the whole system in general. It's about keeping our community safe so that we don't stress it out even more. People's recovery is going to look different depending on their situation. So that's really important to pay attention to. I think if you get hung up on the number of hospital beds, you're kind of missing the point.
Thank you. I don't see any other lights on. Okay.
Very good. Dr. Stedman, please.
Morning, Dr. Shelley.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. I'm Shelley Stedman. I am currently the DNA technical leader at the Sedgwick County Regional Forensic Science Center, and more recently have been tasked with also serving as the interim director for the facility. And in that capacity, one of my first tasks was to develop a strategic plan for the Forensic Science Center. I learned that the last comprehensive strategic plan was probably developed in 1999. And so in that process, I began to rethink about what our purpose was and the differences between the two very unique aspects of our facility, one being the coroner's office, the other being the crime lab, and how we could express the importance of those separately, but also our common goals. And in doing so, we developed a new mission, and because it's fairly new, I'm going to read that to you today. The Forensic Science Center strives to provide the highest quality medical, legal, and advanced forensic laboratory services to Sedgwick County. Death investigation and forensic autopsy services are conducted in a compassionate and objective manner to achieve accurate certification of cause and manner of death. The forensic laboratory services provide unbiased and accurate analytical testing to support the resolution of criminal cases. As an independent agency operating under the Division of Public Safety, the Forensic Science Center collaborates with public health and criminal justice stakeholders to reduce crime and prevent deaths. With that, I'm going to start to tell you a little bit about what goes on at the Forensic Science Center. After that, I'm going to talk about what some of our challenges have been and why this project began. And then at the end, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the importance of what we do and the importance of having these services here locally. And I've invited the district attorney, Mr. Bennett, here to help in my explanation of those important factors. I'm going to begin by talking about the coroner's services. And I full well understand that my role here today is to inform you so that you can understand what's going on at this facility and you can make the best decision for the constituents of Sedgwick County. I'm not here to sell this building or this project to you today, but if it seems contrary to that, it's because I'm extremely passionate about what goes on there. And it's always heartwarming to talk about first responders, but it's far less heartwarming to talk about last responders. Those people go out into the field and their customer has either experienced the last day of their life or is a relative to that decedent who's experiencing one of the worst days of their life, and it is a hard job. But I'm really honored to be standing here today to advocate for their needs. That said, I'll begin by explaining that Sedgwick County receives well over 3,000 reports of death annually. Of those, about 900 of those are determined to be coroner's cases, and those 900 cases come to our facility for some form of postmortem examination, usually a full autopsy. And about half of those cases involve the need for a medical investigator to report to the scene to conduct a full medical investigation and to serve as the eyes and ears of the coroner. On the crime lab side, I'll begin by saying that it's fair to say the greater percentage of criminal cases that are adjudicated in the 18th Judicial District are touched by our center in some form or fashion. And what this slide shows you is that there has been a slight decrease in the number of cases that we get, but that the complexity of those cases or the number of exhibits that we are testing has remained mostly the same. This has to do with some change in laws. It also has to do in some changes in the way we were doing business. In our drug ID unit, at one point we had 2 people retire and we had 2 other people who were diagnosed with late-stage cancer, which put us at a huge staffing disadvantage. And we began to work with the courts to determine how we could refocus our resources. That resulted in us working only charged cases or cases being charged based on field testing. And then if the case didn't plea, it would come to our facility for confirmatory testing in preparation for trial. Over the course of the years, there have also been a loosening of laws as it relates to possession of marijuana. That has resulted in fewer first offenses being submitted for testing to our laboratory. This slide shows you the type of services we provide. The bulk of the testing is drug identification related. We do DNA and biology testing. The toxicology postmortem testing involves testing of tissues that are collected during autopsy for the determination of drugs and drug metabolites and eventually the cause and manner of death. We also do testing in toxicology on living people. That's called human performance testing or antemortem testing. That means DUIs, DUIDs, and even drug-facilitated sexual assaults. Some of our chemists are cross-trained to perform fire debris testing, which is useful in arson investigations. And what this pie graph probably underrepresents is the importance of firearms analysis, but we've had significant staffing challenges in our firearms laboratory, and firearms is probably one of the disciplines with the greatest impact overall for the investigation of violent crimes. What I want to point out here before I get too far into this project is it's been talked about as the DNA addition, and it is true that the DNA lab will inhabit most of the new space, but the addition will accommodate needs across the board in our facility, and part of this process involved preliminary program of space analysis, and through that we were able to identify the areas of greatest need for additional space, and we'll prioritize those when we repurpose the area that the DNA laboratory will vacate. I'm going to begin by talking about the needs in the firearms laboratory. This is an image of our firing range, and this is where we're supposed to be able to fire weapons for things like distance determination, but as you can see, it's currently being used to store most of our long guns. We are required to maintain a reference library of guns like that for training purposes, and also so that if we receive a weapon under a case that's unable to be fired, we can use parts from our reference library to make that functional so that we can produce a test fire, and the ammunition components, the bullets and the cartridge casings that are necessary for comparison to crime scene evidence. We also have a partnership with the developing National Crime Gun Intelligence Center on the Innovation Campus, and we are a sub-grantee with money designated for a third firearms examiner. We would probably be hiring a trainee, but we do not currently have any dedicated office space for that person, nor do we have space for a third microscope for them to train and conduct casework. Next, I'll move on to the needs of the toxicology lab, and as you can see by the image there, most of the bench space is occupied by analytical equipment, leaving very little room for a person to work or even take notes. To that end, last year we received significant grant funding for newer mass spec technology that can be used for more sensitive and specific testing on toxicology samples. When we installed this instrumentation in what was previously an autopsy tissue storage space, the instrumentation warmed the room so much that we then had to modify our HVAC system. One of those instruments had to be located in the annex, which is quite a distance from the toxicology lab proper, and I'll show you that later. There are instances where autopsies are performed on infectious bodies or very high-risk decedents, and those toxicology samples are transferred to the laboratory, and we don't really have any dedicated space to deal with those. We also do not have work areas where people can be distanced, and I want to be very clear that we started looking at these problems back in 2014, and this most recent proposal began well over a year ago. And so this has nothing to do with the COVID crisis that we're facing now. But what I can tell you is that it certainly has exacerbated our existing situation for space, because it's become even more difficult for us to stagger our workspace or keep people at a safe distance from each other. This is an image of our existing tissue storage area. When an autopsy is conducted, organs are preserved from that body. They are placed in a plastic container that's filled with formalin that fixes those tissues. And it is mandated by law that we retain those tissues for a specific period of time. Beyond that, our accreditation bodies and best practice dictates that those tissues be saved for an extended period of time, that beyond what would be required by statute. And the problem with our tissue storage room is that, as you're well aware, we have designated now CARES funding to expand our walk-in cooler. And the space where that walk-in cooler is going to go is where our tissues are currently being stored. So the big challenge with the walk-in cooler is now to relocate years and years of tissues that are stored in formalin and require somewhat specialized storage conditions moving forward. What we have decided to do to that end is several months ago we did discontinue formally the use of a designated area for transplant recovery. Midwest Transplant Network and Wichita iBank had been using a room. We have now designated the use of that room for our autopsy staff because they really need a place to safely don PPE before their procedures, to take breaks or to eat. And we're not allowing those people to do so in the break rooms where the rest of the laboratory staff is. The reason that is important is because a cluster at the Regional Forensic Science Center, specifically among our autopsy staff, would be a big crisis because those bodies need to be examined within a certain period of time. So with all of the space needs identified, why would we designate the new area for a DNA laboratory? And I think part of the reason is that of all of the forensic disciplines, DNA has probably advanced the most rapidly and significantly in the last 25 years. When I began working at the Forensic Science Center was about the time when O.J. Simpson was driving his Bronco down the freeway and arguably hiding his bloody clothing. And we were doing DNA testing on stains that were the size of dimes and quarters. Now we can obtain DNA results from samples that were just touched. And the reason we're able to do that is we target areas of the DNA that are extremely unique between individuals, and we amplify that DNA. So we're taking a small amount of DNA and creating large copies of it. It's very important then that that amplified DNA is not reintroduced into areas of the lab where we're screening evidence at the beginning of the workflow, because that would present huge contamination issues. So many of the controls that are imposed upon DNA are far more excessive than the other forensic science disciplines. Some of the controls are very hard to put into the existing infrastructure because they would involve things like airlock or pressure-controlled rooms. We also are facing a situation where some of our final DNA typing is conducted in a room that's not on a backup generator. We have no circuits remaining to dedicate to instrumentation, and adding computers is also a limitation because all of our network ports are full. So the last thing that I want to address as it relates to the DNA lab is that in comparison to the other disciplines, we are held at a slightly higher level of audit standards. We fall under the FBI quality assurance standards based on the nature of the crimes that DNA often is used to address, and also involves our ability to participate in CODIS, which is the national database, whereby we can upload crime scene profiles and search against convicted offenders and other unsolved cases. Another difference between the DNA science and other disciplines is if a drug chemist will test a substance and tell you what drug is present. A DNA analyst does not just issue a result with a DNA profile in it. There's a significant amount of work on the back end of interpreting that profile and forming an opinion about who may or may not have been responsible for depositing DNA at the crime scenes. And that said, they spend a lot of time at their desk performing that interpretation, but these desks are so small we can't even accommodate dual computer screens. We're facing national recommendations for the implementation of robotics to address the sexual assault backlog, and we do not currently have any bench space for additional small-scale robotics. We are purchasing four such small-scale robotics that we should probably be receiving in the upcoming 2 months, but thereafter we will not be able to accommodate any additional automation. I have people in my lab who are 5'2", and I have people who are 6'2", and those people don't work well at the same analytical bench. When our building was designed, the place where we worked to screen large exhibits of evidence, such as a comforter, those are not height adjustable. You spend hours in a dark room leaning over a very tedious exhibit, and it's difficult to do when you're unable to adjust those heights. We also are at the point where we cannot add any scientists. I do know that there has been an emphasis in the county strategic plan for creative recruiting, and I can't think of a better way of recruiting people to do this job than to have them come to our facility and work with the wonderful people who are there. But we do not have the opportunity to reasonably provide the work area for that type of collaboration. I'm going to move on to a little bit of explaining the workflow challenges that we have so you can understand how the building is laid out and how we have tried to, over the course of years, find space to meet the needs that continue to grow. This is an aerial view of our facility, and if you've visited the facility, you probably have entered in this main building, which it's labeled 1995 for the year it was built. And to the lower right aspect of that, you can see the parking lot and the main entrance. In 2010, we added an annex, which was mainly to accommodate the growing needs of drug identification and our evidence intake. In around 2003, we had a consolidation with the Wichita Police Department, and we absorbed a couple of chemists at that time, and this allowed us to better accommodate that consolidated service. And this image shows you the proposed footprint for the new space, which is on land that the county already owns. And I was working with several images here to try to give you a fair overview of what this would look like, but I can't say that that's necessarily to scale, but it gives you some idea of the position of the new space with respect to the existing buildings. If we would take the roof off of that building, this is the floor plan that you would see. And this series of yellow arrows shows the different places where DNA analysts are office. We have 3 in one and 1 each in a couple of the other spaces. So when I need to do casework, I have to walk from my office to the main laboratory, which, as you've seen on the aerial view, is about half a city block. And it's not extremely efficient for me to do a little bit of lab work and then walk back to my office and continue some other procedures while my samples are running. We also have added space that was converted from first a photo lab and then was changed to a quality assurance laboratory. And this is the DNA lab, main lab, and this is an area that we recently did a small renovation so that we could prepare our chemicals and reagents. And the reason for that renovation was the acquisition of the robotics that was going to use the space where the reagent preparation was previously conducted. And while that space looks in fairly close proximity, it is not continuous. And in fact, once chemicals are prepared, they have to be taken out into the main corridor and walked around to enter into the main lab. And some of these chemicals are caustic or carcinogenic, so we'd like to limit the transport of harmful reagents and chemicals. Additionally, The main laboratory, as indicated by the yellow arrow, is quite a distance from where a person would go to pick up their evidence. Evidence is submitted in the upper right-hand corner where I've put the sunshine, and law enforcement submits their evidence there, and it's kept until we're ready to perform casework analysis. So to get your evidence, you have the same walk to pick that up and gain custody. Likewise, in the main DNA laboratory office, we house the CODIS terminal. And if we get a CODIS hit and we are interested in seeing the information in the related case or the positive association that we could provide to law enforcement as an investigative lead, our file room is located also at the opposite end of the building. And to that, I also want to point out it is very important that we are able to maintain file storage on site for DNA files. We have had several cases where we got a very important positive association and were able to provide much needed investigative leads on high-profile crimes. If those files would have been in the salt mines, simply getting the information would have taken days. So having identified sort of the disjointed nature of our existing facility, the obvious goal of this project is to take all of those functions and to put them into one space. A space that is fluidly designed and that also meets the best practice recommendations in today's DNA world. I'm not going to go into a lot of discussion about the workflow and the thought behind this particular design, but suffice it to say that we did look at the National Institute of Standard and Technology recommendations for forensic laboratory design, which includes, for example, the recommended linear foot of bench space a DNA analyst should have for certain types of examinations, and is also designed in accordance with the Standard County recommendations for office spaces. It's designed to allow for a workflow that prevents contamination and to allow for modest growth in employees if the need should arise. The last thing I want to address about the design is to talk a little bit about the fact that this is the second time we've gone through the process for designing a building. The first design involved a 2-story building. And the reason that is that I don't think it was clearly recognized that we may be able to get a variance for parking. And we have a unique building in that is quite large with quite a bit of circulation space, but we don't have a lot of traffic at the Regional Forensic Science Center other than the employees themselves and law enforcement who is delivering evidence at specified time points. So that said, the proposal that we have presented now would require a variance for parking, and the same variance was also achieved when we added the annex in 2010. So that's not considered to be a big roadblock for this particular layout, but was part of the consideration and thought process behind the previously proposed 2-story project. This slide gives you some idea of the cost estimates that have been developed for the project. Probably more feasible for year 2023, which was determined by 3% per year interest added. And that brings the total cost, if you account for renovation of the existing space, to $4.2 million. And I do know that Valerie Castor is here today to speak toward how that was arrived upon. So I'm going to switch gears now a little bit and talk about the value of these services to the community, Sedgwick County, and the region. Clearly, science is always progressing, and to progress, we have to stay relevant, and there's a significant investment in that progress. Do I want to be the best in the region? Of course I do. But at the end of the day, I just really want to be sure that we're meeting the standards and the best practices recommendation in our field. And ultimately, I want to avoid something like a contamination event that would bring the lab to the forefront of the media in some form of a negative light. And I'm not here today to tell you that's where we're headed. In fact, I'm here today to assure you that that is not where we're headed, and to point out the positive things that I have seen going on in this facility over the last couple of decades. One very unique thing about our facility is that we have combined autopsy, tox, and drug ID services in one organization, and we do provide metrics to the health department, to law enforcement, and to advocacy groups in a real-time manner. This allows us to have an early understanding of increase in suicide. We can understand an increase in drug overdose cases. We can respond to trends in opioids, methamphetamine, and fentanyl. For example, it was our lab that determined the oxy pills that were stamped to look like oxy were in fact fentanyl. Our location here in Wichita allows a very unique collaboration with our stakeholders. We're able to have conversations to avoid confusion on findings. I can tell you that when someone has to submit a DNA case that involves 3 scenes and 2 homicides, the best way to do that is to sit down in the same room, look at the crime scene photos, and determine what is best for DNA testing. Our location is also used by undercover narcotic officers. They come there to weigh their drugs and to conduct their field testing in controlled environment. Law enforcement is also restricted from opening certain packages that could have potentially dangerous substances, and we've had them into our facility so they can use our fume hoods to explore things that may contain things like fentanyl. I think the main advantage that we have to offer is that we definitely streamline expert witness testimony in the courts, and I'm sure Mr. Bennett will agree that a defense attorney is far more likely to require an expert to show up if it's inconvenient for that expert to be there. And they're just far less likely to stipulate on a case. That drags the whole process out longer. This location allows us to respond quickly, and there are occasions where a subpoena is not sent out, and we get a surprise that we're going to court that day, and we're able to run right over and do that. With respect to the services at the KBI and their capability, I should begin by talking a little bit about their initiative to look at sexual assault kits throughout the state, and I served on that task force, and they did have a grant and were able to examine most of the untested kits that were in existence. However, that was grant funded, and I'm not sure what their capacity is going to be going forward to test the kits that we were not necessarily testing for the purpose of prosecution. The current layout is that the investigators evaluate each and every sexual assault and determine if there's evidence useful for DNA, and if there is, the cases that are submitted to our lab are those that are most likely to be adjudicated so that we can meet the needs for the trial deadline and be present to testify. But the far greater majority of the kits are going to the KBI, and I'm not sure how long that capacity will be there. They are clearly facing the same economic difficulty as our organization. This week I'm in dialogue with the KBI in Johnson County about a formula grant for DNA capacity enhancement, and they have severe needs for the ongoing upgrades to their LIMS system. And I should point out that there was a period of 6 weeks where the KBI closed, and that was in response to the pandemic. And our response was to partition the laboratory services the best way we could and to continue to remain fully functional. That said, I can't generate a DNA profile working from home, and we have had people working from home for the aspects of their workflow that they can do there. And it's never as efficient as being in your natural workspace, but we have continued to move forward. And I think drug submissions have declined quite a bit during that period of time, but the sexual assaults, the aggravated robberies, and the burglaries have not. Another good point about our facility is that with the DNA services right there where autopsies occur. We are able to conduct DNA identification on unidentified remains, and this is frequent, especially during the summer months where the rate of decomposition is very rapid. And we have received calls from colleagues at private labs and also at the state lab for advice on extracting these remains, because this is something we do routinely that most labs are not specifically excited about. The other thing to think about is our capacity in our cooler, because these bodies have to remain in the cooler until that DNA identification is completed. And aside from the capacity issues, you also have a family waiting for that information. So we try to expedite those cases. Postmortem toxicology is not conducted anywhere else in the state of Kansas. It's unique to our facility. The reports, I think of the greatest significance about this point is that our reports are explicitly admissible in preliminary hearings without supporting testimony from the chemist or analyst who prepared those results. And that statutory provision would not apply to a third-party lab, because a third-party lab would not be in the state of Kansas. If we outsource those samples, we would still have significant staff present to process and send those out. They would go to an out-of-state lab, and then the DA's office would have to have air travel and accommodations expenses out of their budget to bring those people to the county to testify. And it would prevent our toxicology staff from providing consultation to our doctors while the autopsies are actually ongoing. We also do some toxicology service on antemortem in the respect of antemortem testing that don't occur anywhere else in Kansas either. We actually perform drug quantifications on our human performance testing casework. And what does that mean? Well, it's nice to know that somebody has fentanyl in their system, but for the DA, it's really important to know how much. And it's really important to know if that amount had any impairment on that individual. So if you ask how those cases are prosecuted in other jurisdictions, they will literally tell you that they're hit or miss. We have the ability to uniquely quantitate 80 drugs and metabolites, and as designer drugs come about, we develop new methods all the time. And we have unique ability to perform heavy metal analysis, carbon monoxide testing, analysis for special volatiles, and cyanide testing. And in terms of our drug identification laboratory, our superiority right now is really in our turnaround time. In the last 8 months, we have become fully staffed, and our law enforcement agencies are getting their drug identification reports in 2 weeks. Other counties submitting to labs in other parts of the state would wait 6 months for the same. The center can actually complete drug identification testing in a period of 24 hours, and this routinely happens where immediately following an undercover buy, the undercover narc will submit the substance to our lab for testing. The very next day, they can get a search warrant, and a drug bust can happen shortly thereafter. A few other points that I want to discuss is Sedgwick County, as I mentioned earlier, did agree to provide services to the city and consolidated with them, and 2 of their drug chemists came over as Sedgwick County employees. One of those drug chemists was also providing serological analysis, which is things like ABO blood typing. Clearly, that type of testing at that point was being phased out for the far more discriminating DNA technology that was coming into play. The importance of that consolidation and those agreements is that we really need to continue those services, and this has allowed us to provide accredited services to our community, and it also allows us some grant opportunities. I think moving services elsewhere in Sedgwick County would certainly put cases in the queue behind all the other cases being submitted statewide. I also think that outsourcing would have significant impact on our stakeholders and our community in terms of delayed forensic results. The inability to really model or advance technology locally to expedite analysis. The cases would not benefit from the established relationship between investigators, law enforcement, and prosecutors. We would no longer be able to provide metrics to advocate prevention and recovery, and I know that's very important to this commission. There would certainly be implications to prosecuting cases, an inconvenience to city courts, and added costs to the district attorney's office. And if we're going to redirect our analysis to other laboratories, probably the formula grant dollars that we currently enjoy would also be redirected. And I think in the end, nobody wins. So that is my presentation today, and I would be happy to learn your questions and do my best to address them.
Thank you, Doctor. It was very informative, very comprehensive. We're going to have a question or comment from Commissioner Cruz, but I'd like to also hear from Mark Bennett when you have a chance. So, Commissioner Cruz.
Thank you. Dr. Stedman, that was really fascinating. When I went and toured, I thoroughly enjoyed just learning about everything that happens at the Forensic Science Center. There is a lot that goes on there. And I don't have any questions currently, but I'm sure once I mull over all of this information, I know this probably, this is very thorough, and I really appreciate you taking the time to map this out for us. So I just really appreciate you being here, and again, that was really riveting. I really enjoyed that presentation.
Commissioner Dennis?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Dr. Stedman, I appreciate you being here and speaking with us, and for our DA being in here to support what your request is. I think that the Regional Forensic Science Center is a great value to Sedgwick County in this area. By the same token, if we didn't do it, KBI would be required to. I don't know if there's any, and I know that the state is in as bad a financial situation as anyone is right now, but I would certainly like to see if there's any way that in our next legislative cycle that we could see if we could get some additional funding from the KBI, because we're offsetting the costs of everything they do. Am I mistaken?
Well, certainly they do absorb, they would probably be faced with absorbing additional caseload. They do also provide some services that we don't provide, like YSTR testing. And so as statewide, we've tried to work very hard to provide the type of analysis for the samples that everybody needs and be partners that way. As far as whose responsibility it is for the funding, I think that's beyond the scope of my expertise here today, and is your decision.
I understand what you do is extremely valuable. I guess my only question, and we probably need to work it with the manager and other folks, but if we didn't have this asset here in Sedgwick County, someone would have to do it, and we are offsetting the expense to that someone, which I believe is probably KBI. So I don't see any reason we wouldn't go at our next legislative agenda and ask the state if they would help us with the funding of this organization. And I know we get grants and so forth that help us out, but your ask is something that I think is within reason. But I also would like to make sure that other people that are not participating in this, in what we're doing here, have an opportunity to help us fund something like this too. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Commissioner Howell?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just, well, first I want to say thank you for the presentation again. And Dr. Stedman, by the way, everyone should know that she's also the mayor of the great city of Mulvane, so thank you for your service there as well. I do have a question that's kind of related to Commissioner Dennis's question. That is, if we have this lab and we stand this up and it has all these capabilities, do we expect that we'll see work that comes outside of Sedgwick County come into our lab here, that we would provide that service, if you will?
We do, on rare occasion, provide out-of-county services, and we have a fees established for that, but because they do not have to pay those fees at the KBI, they will usually only use our services if there's a time crunch, for example. We do perform an abundance of out-of-county autopsies, and that is a revenue-generating process for the county. And so with respect to the coroner's office, that is very routine.
Can you help us understand about how many of the autopsies are investigative in terms of trying to figure out whether we should or should not go towards a prosecution of some sort, or is there just some trying to understand, if you will, issues going on in the community that are important, I guess, to the community overall? I mean, some of the work that's done there, it sounds like, is not necessarily tied to a crime, a potential crime, and yet we still do that work. Is there any way to quantify how much of that is?
So overdose cases, for example, can give, I'm in constant contact with Wichita Police Department and even other groups interested in tracking the trends in crime and using that information to direct their investigations. Specifically, I'm asked by the KU Med School as to suicide prevention. Has this particular pandemic caused an uptick in suicides, for example, is something we're tracking. Is a suicide a criminal death or really involve a criminal investigation? No, but it provides important health information. And years ago, when we were testing drugs that were involved in cases that maybe weren't prosecuted, it helps us understand what those drug trends are and what we need to be looking for, what's prevalent in our region. And we participate in a lot of national databases that compile that data and share it nationwide. So there is value from the perspective of health safety in the non-criminal aspects of the work that's performed there.
Who is it that actually makes decisions on whether someone should have an autopsy? Is that something that we make that decision by policy, or how's that decided?
It's dictated by statute, by the type of case. For example, deaths that occur by criminal means, deaths that occur when someone is apparently healthy, all child deaths, all suicides, there's certain classifications. And our medical investigators, when the call comes in, they evaluate the circumstances and they determine if it's a coroner's case or not.
Very good. I had a couple of other questions. You know, a lot of our organizations have performance measures they create. Things like, to give some examples, might be number of tests you guys conduct, the number of days for something before, it comes into your queue before you're able to provide that report, what your backlog happens to look like, that type of data. Is that available for the Forensic Science Center?
Yes. We track that for all of our disciplines. We report that for our grant metrics in order, we have routine reporting requirements. And yes, so just yesterday I spent most of the day compiling that data as it was related to the DNA lab. Give us some idea of how many cases come in during a period, how many cases are completed, what our backlog is, what are the factors that may have affected that over a period of time, and we have clear tracking of those trends.
I assume if we fund this expansion, that we would have to see some staff, of course, I think would need to fill some of that space to increase our capacity. That's part of the plan, although it's not presented here today. Is that reasonable to understand that?
There's space for that to happen. There is space for it.
I guess what I'm saying is, you do have, I think, 4 metrics here on the couple of slides here at the beginning of your presentation today. Do I think that those numbers will be improved, if you will? I'm not sure if there's anything here that we can have any control over. This talks about how many cases, for example, you've had to touch, and so you can't impact that. But in terms of our ability to process more and do more, try to keep the date, the data flowing as quickly as possible back to the district attorney, for example. Do we anticipate that those metrics will be improved with this addition?
Well, the whole point, yes, is to improve our efficiency in our workflows so that we can I think there's the increase in capacity is so that we can increase our throughput and reduce our backlog, and ultimately that's the goal of the project. That said, it is complicated because as crime is on the rise and as the cases we get continue to be more and more complex, what we are usually able to do is basically keep that stabilized.
I would like to get those performance measures if I could, and if they go back just, sometime in the past, it might be helpful to see that. And then my final question is this, because we had a lot of press about the cooler we just authorized through the CARES funds. Can you clarify, how many people have you had to process, I assume through autopsies or whatever? What impact has COVID-19 had on your processes there at the Forensic Science Center? Have you had to process and do autopsies as a result?
In virtue of the number of autopsies were conducted, I can't say that significantly changed because I explained most of those cases, most of the COVID cases would not be coroner cases. They would not qualify as coroner cases. Now, there's been some inconvenience in our workflow and partitioning of the building and things taking longer. It's much more difficult to do your job when you're in a spacesuit than when you're wearing a simple surgical mask and a gown. But by and large, I would say that the number of bodies probably has not been affected by the pandemic.
So let me just restate the question. I think you kind of answered it. Let me just make sure we're totally on the same page here. Out of the 28 deaths we've had in Sedgwick County, none of those have come through the RF or the Forensic Science Center. Is that?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Mr. Dennis?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one last question. Your real request from all of this is either to include the cost of this in either the 2021 or 2023 CIP. Oh, I don't know. I think my question is mainly for the manager. We need to know what the impact of these both are on our budgeting process as we're moving forward, and what the forecast is going to be looking at for 2021 and 2023. I know 2021 doesn't look real good right now, but we need to, I've heard of this request ever since I've been on the commission. So this is not a new request to us. This is not new information that something like this is needed. But we truly need to see what that looks like overall in our budgeting process for both of those years, because Dr. Stedman listed both of those years here. So as we move forward on a decision, we need to have some good information on how that we could fit this into our budget.
Very good, sir. Yes.
Thank you,
Can I speak to that? So, Commissioner, as you said, this has been in the CIP for a number of years. It's been on the watch list many of those years. And because we employed an architect to go through and do a space study and then come back with a revised recommendation, which is what she presented today, it came off of the watch list and was placed tentatively in an outer year for consideration. But as we move forward with the budget process, our CFO and the manager and I will, the CFO will provide you with what that looks like, and you guys can make decisions. And so nothing is set in stone at this point. That CIP is very fluid, and we put things on it and recommend a year, and sometimes they get pushed back, and sometimes they get moved up, and sometimes they get pushed off to the watch list. So this is a recommendation for you guys to consider, but nothing is set in stone at this point.
Very good. Well, we're working very hard on our 2021 budget right now. And,
yes, sir.
I don't recall this being in our 2021 CIP.
It is not.
So
it is not.
We need to figure out which direction that we're going forward.
Just a small clarification. The 2021 number was just placed there to show the 3% growth that brought us to 2023. It's not on the 2021 CIP. So.
Very good. Well, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Mark Bennett, you've been here all morning. Thank you for your patience. Just if you had anything to add, we'd like to hear it.
I appreciate it, Chairman. I was mainly here just to show support for Ms. Stedman, Dr. Stedman, and her program. I'll give you a couple quick anecdotes. I know it's been a long morning, but I'm here. I might as well bend your ear for a minute. But I would say that, you share this with Commissioner Howell, but one of his questions earlier was, are there things that we do that aren't directly related to criminal cases? And the answer is yes, but that also is directly related to criminal cases, meaning a body will be found. There will be, just yesterday, I stood with homicide detectives and looked into the trunk of a car and the dead body, and it was a pretty warm day yesterday. It was a pretty warm weekend, and it wasn't entirely clear in that environment what the race of the individual was we were looking at, let alone what the cause of death was. I can't go into court and say, well, he's dead. I mean, what more do you need? I need an expert to come in and tell me the cause of death. And not only that, but there are times when a very high-profile case, very, very much in the recent media, about a young woman who was found in a rural part of southern part of the county. Coroner took a look and made a determination that whatever the cause of death was, it was not a homicidal act at the hands of a third party. If I didn't know that, I could be spinning my wheels for weeks and months investigating things, and so would law enforcement. It's not just the cases we bring to court, but it's the utilization of the expertise of these individuals that tells us that we've got the right person, or that we should even be exercising investigatory resources in pursuit of something that may not be legitimate. I can't tell you how many times you read about people being exonerated years after the fact due to some sort of DNA analysis. And this jurisdiction, despite our size, despite the fact that we contribute on annually north of 20% of the criminal cases of the entire state of Kansas come out of this courthouse that we're sitting in now, we have not had a situation like that. The Attorney General's office has only had one situation where he had a expenditure on somebody, and it had nothing to do. I mean, it was a guy who was convicted. His case was overturned on a technicality, and so it had nothing to do with the wrong guy. The question was whether or not his crime was technically a crime under the laws of the state of Kansas in 1988. I won't bore you with the details unless you're interested, but the point is we have a reliable DNA lab here, and this community has benefited from its presence in this community for over 25 years now. I can tell you that the expertise of the folks who work there has increased, as have the expectations. It started off in the mid-90s, my first DNA direct examination with someone from KBI. I worked in a different jurisdiction where we relied on the KBI, and the guy showed up, handed me a piece of paper and said, ask me these questions, don't ask me anything else, and shut up and let me talk. I went, okay. And he did, and I just sat there and listened to him. And the numbers were, 1 in 3,000, 1 in 2,000. Today, with Dr. Stedman and her team of experts, we'll put numbers in front of juries that are, 1 in 600, 6-7 quintillion. The discriminatory aspect of what these folks can do and how discreet they can be in their testing is mind-blowing. Last two things, I'll give you anecdotes. She mentioned earlier that our ability to work 2002, I got a phone call at lunch that I needed to go west to Ridge and Central. When I crossed the bridge there at the big ditch, it looked like every cop in south central Kansas was on scene, and the truth was they were. And was what later became the capital murder case of Doug Velt. And I sat down with Kenny Landwehr and the detectives who worked that case, and we went over to Shelley's office, and we sat there, 10 or 15 of us, and said, we've got to go through every piece of evidence. And there were tens of thousands, that may be a bit of an exaggeration, but thousands of articles of items to be tested. And we sat down on 3 separate occasions saying, okay, let's test this, let's test this. Hours poring over this information with one another in a room, trying to figure out what would be the best utilization of resources to make sure we got the right guy who was capable of this just shockingly horrific crime. And on the third wave, after Shelley gave us, really 3 different days of her time or afternoons of her time going through this, she called me literally and said, are you sitting down? I'm sitting, why are you, shut up and tell me. And she did, and the DNA was fantastic, and it changed the case. We could not have done that without this lab locally here. The other thing I would tell you is even more, and that was interesting, and that was a great anecdote, but the one that's even more to me telling is we had a child that was brutalized sexually a couple of years ago in a home by an unknown intruder. It was let's just say it was shocking to the conscience. We needed to know who had done this. And then in every case, when it's a child, the very first thing that you just do, because you have to, is make sure that no one around her life, no one in her life, is the suspect. It would be, not only would it have been a horrible thing for this child to endure, but it would have been, we would have compounded the horror on that family had we made a mistake and arrested the wrong person, assuming it was somebody in her life. It wasn't. It was, in fact, the boogeyman, somebody who came in unannounced, broke in, had no ties to this family, and we got his DNA within 4 days because somebody in her lab stayed up and literally went to work, came home at night, after work at 5, made dinner for her family, and then went back to the lab and worked around the clock for 4 days before she got that guy's DNA in the local database that they had here. We don't, I mean, I would have been making phone calls to Derek Schmidt, Kirk Thompson, the director of the KBI. I would have pulled every string I had trying to get that, and I'm sure they would have, anecdotally. But then again, they also have 104 counties they're dealing with, because Johnson County has their own. KBI is beholden to everyone else in the state. We have a footprint of 20+% of the criminal cases in the state ourselves, and to have that lab here where I can make one call and say, I need this, and they said, we'll drop everything. And we had, I mean, there was a collective sigh of relief from law enforcement, from that family, and frankly from anyone who was paying attention in the community, that the guy who did that was taken off the streets. Less than a year later, he was put in front of a jury of his peers in this jurisdiction and found guilty, based largely, almost exclusively on the testimony of one of the good people who works for Dr. Stedman. So I can go on and on. I can't overstate how much I support any effort to support Forensic Science Center here in Sedgwick County. We need it. The cost to my operations and vicariously to the county, if it wasn't here, it would go up exponentially. I have to have DNA. I have to have coroners. I can't do gun cases by statute and case law unless I can prove that the gun went bang and that the shell casings and the bullets that came out of it were in fact the ones related to that particular gun. There was a time when prosecutors could come to court with a file that thick, walk in and ask the cop who did it, the cop would tell them, and off we went. Frankly, that wasn't a particularly good system, and at this point in time, I can't think of a type of case where DNA forensic analysis isn't at least relevant. It comes up in every type of case, whether it's a drug case, gun case, sexual assault, you name it. So I'm very much support of the Science Center, Dr. Stedman, and the work of her staff. And if I can ever be of any service to any of you in terms of giving you numbers to support the request, any request they have to make, let me know, because I just can't imagine a district attorney's office in this day and age of our size existing without access to a lab like this. So appreciate your time.
Thanks, Mark. You know, I appreciate you taking time to address the commission. It's
Yes, sir.
always valuable. You're able to give us real life. You're able to explain it very well.
It's important to me.
I was listening to Dr. Stedman's presentation. I was becoming more and more supportive of this. Kind of new to me. I didn't realize it had been in the CIP program watch list for a while. Commissioner Dennis helped explain that. So I was going to extend that I'm supportive of kind of accelerating this decision personally. And then, of course, your comments, I'm like, okay, well, what I was feeling was of value. And I do support the fact that we need to maybe work the state to help defer some of the costs or show the value to the state of what we do so we can get some support that way. I think we can parallel track both of these things.
If they're not here, I'm going to the KBI, and if they can't do it, I'm going to go out of state to a private lab and pay them through the nose, name their price. And so,
Right. So we could put together a pretty good, I think we
Yes,
could
sir.
put together a good story for a request.
Absolutely.
I think that's of noteworthy. And
At least for capital, improvements, that type of thing, maybe ongoing expenses, they may not be interested, but at the
There
same
you go.
time,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
matching funds for capital improvement strikes me as not an unreasonable ask.
Yeah, there's operating costs, but the capital side is maybe we'll figure that out. Okay, appreciate it if you're available, and you and Dr. Stedman help us get our story together, and
Yes, sir.
we'll pursue it forward. Okay,
Any other
thank you.
questions?
Thank you again, Mark. Appreciate it. Anything else?
That's all we had, sir.
Okay. That being said, thank you again for everybody being here, and we will adjourn and see everybody tomorrow.